They said this hill was no longer safe. They said it would be torn down, buried beneath glass and steel. But in the hush of that meeting, one old veteran refused to be silenced. And just when the final decision seemed set, the doors of the town hall burst open. A single figure stepped in, none other than Admiral William H. McRaven, and with just 6 words, he brought the entire room to a standstill. What did he say? Stay with us, because this isn't just a story about an old hill. It's about memory, about honor, and about the quiet fight for what truly matters. Welcome to Grateful Stories, where tales of compassion and kindness are told. Let's uncover what really happened. The town of Harborview, Texas, woke every morning to the soft hush of the Gulf. Salted air rolled in gentle waves, weaving through narrow streets and weathered docks. It was the kind of place where neighbors paused to wave, and every story was told in quiet murmurs over coffee. At the edge of this small town, a hill rose gently above the rooftops, and on that hill stood the Veterans Memorial, weathered stone slabs, etched with names that had once laughed and lived here. Names of sons, brothers, fathers now held fast in the embrace of cold granite. For nearly 40 years, Joe Carter was the keeper of that hill. He wasn't a man who needed titles or applause. His back was bent from years of service, his hands lined with calluses. Each dawn, he'd shuffle up the slope, carrying a ragged cloth and a faded bouquet of flowers. He would pause at the edge of the memorial, letting the wind off the Gulf wash over him. Then he would begin his quiet ritual, wiping away the salt that clung to the stone, pressing fresh blooms into weathered vases, whispering names like a prayer, names he had once known as laughter and sweat, now only echoes in the marble. Joe never rushed this task. To him, it was a promise, one he'd made on battlefields far away and carried home in the hollow of his chest. Some mornings, school children would pause, watching the old man lean close to the names, his lips moving, his voice lost to the wind. They didn't understand, not yet, but they would. Someday, they would know what it meant to keep faith with the fallen. The memorial itself was simple, no towering statues or polished bronze, just the stone, worn smooth by decades of sea spray and sun. An American flag flew above it, edges frayed and colors muted by the years. Joe would mend it himself when he could. He'd say a flag didn't need to be new to be proud. But in recent months, a new wind had blown into Harborview, one that didn't carry the scent of salt, but of money. A real estate developer, Granite Shores Group, had set its eyes on the hill. They spoke in town meetings with bright smiles and sharper suits, promises of new shops, a grand promenade, jobs for everyone. They called it progress. Joe called it forgetting. He heard them talk about the cracks in the stone, the shifting of the earth beneath. They said the memorial was no longer safe for the public. They showed pictures, close-ups of hairline fractures, highlighted in red ink, projected on big screens like a school lesson. But Joe knew those cracks better than they did. He knew the difference between a scar and a wound. He'd touched each one with his own hands, traced them the way he traced the lines of his own face in the mirror each morning. Those cracks weren't weakness, they were memory. They were the slow settling of the hill, the weight of years and weather. They were nothing to be feared. He tried to tell them, in his quiet way, but his words were drowned in the rush of glossy presentations and city council votes. At the diner, he heard neighbors wonder if it was time to move on, if maybe the memorial had had its day. Joe said nothing. He just kept coming, every morning, kept wiping, kept tending, kept whispering, because even if no one else stood with him, he would stand. Then one morning, a letter arrived at his door, folded neat and official. It bore the seal of the town, a summons to a public meeting, the final decision on the fate of the hill. Joe read it in silence. The paper trembled in his hand, but not from fear, only from the weight of memory. He walked slowly back to his small kitchen, the kettle already cooling on the stove. He poured himself a cup of coffee, the steam rising soft and fragrant. Outside, the gulls cried over the water, and the sun rose slow and patient. He reached into the drawer beside the sink and took out an old, folded flag. It was small, meant to fit in the palm of his hand. He had carried it with him across oceans, across decades, a keepsake of battles long past, a promise, too. He pressed the cloth flat against the table, smoothing the creases with gentle hands. Then he folded it again, tight and sure, and tucked it into the breast pocket of his worn jacket. When he stepped out into the morning light, the breeze caught the edge of his coat. He paused at the bottom of the hill, turning to look once more at the stones he had tended for so long. In the distance, the new buildings of Harbor View glimmered in the sun, glass and steel rising where wood and memory used to stand. But on that hill, the wind still carried the names of old friends, and Joe Carter still carried the quiet weight of those who had gone before him. He walked toward the town hall that morning with the slow, measured steps of a man who knows time doesn't move any faster for the hurry of others. Each footfall was a promise, one he would keep, no matter how many suits waited in that room. As he reached the steps of the town hall, he paused, feeling the rough stone beneath his fingertips. He took a breath, deep and steady, and lifted his chin. In that moment, the old soldier's back straightened, and his eyes were clear and unwavering. Because for Joe Carter, there were things that didn't belong to the living. They belonged to the quiet, to the fallen, to the hill that had held their names for so long. He stepped inside, the flag against his heart, and walked toward the meeting that would decide the fate of the place he called sacred. And in his silence, there was a voice louder than any plea. Because sometimes the truest way to honor the dead is to stand steady and unshaken for the living. Joe Carter stepped into the town hall, the air thick with a hush that spoke louder than any word. Rows of folding chairs stretched out before him, every seat filled with neighbors and strangers alike. At the front, a long wooden table held the weight of the council, faces stern, papers stacked, decisions waiting to be made. He moved slowly to the end of the first row, settling onto a hard metal chair. The men in suits, their hair slick and their ties starched, filled the front rows. Their laptops glowed softly, spreadsheets and renderings of a future they were already selling. In the back, familiar faces from Harbor View watched with wary eyes fishermen, teachers, young mothers holding restless toddlers. A low murmur ran through the crowd as the meeting was called to order. The gavel fell, a sharp crack against the wood, and the room fell silent. The mayor, a woman with kind eyes but a guarded expression, welcomed everyone, her voice steady even as her hands fidgeted with a stack of papers. Joe's hands rested on his lap, fingers wrapped around the brim of his old army hat. He didn't need to speak first. He knew the order of things, knew how the world of polished shoes and careful words worked. So he waited, listening as the developer's lawyer rose and began to speak. The lawyer's voice was smooth, practiced. He spoke of opportunity and growth, of tax revenue and job creation. He gestured to a large screen behind him, where images of a gleaming shopping center glowed, bright renderings of glass walls and shining storefronts. He called it a new chapter for Harbor View. He called the hill underutilized land. Joe listened. He heard every word, but he didn't let it settle into his bones, because he knew that progress wasn't built on the bones of the dead. Not here, not on that hill. When the lawyer finished, the mayor invited Joe to speak. The old man rose slowly, his knees stiff with age but his back straight as a rifle. He moved to the small podium at the center of the room, clearing his throat once before he spoke. "I don't have degrees," he said, his voice rough like gravel, but unwavering. "I don't know much about economics or projections." His eyes scanned the crowd, pausing on the faces that watched him with cautious hope. "But I know what it means to stand in a place where men have fallen." He lifted the army hat in his hands, holding it like a relic. "This memorial, it's not just stone and grass, it's memory." His voice was low, but every word carried. And memory is what binds us together. Long after the noise of profit and progress fades, for a moment, the room was still. Even the suits shifted in their seats, caught in the weight of that old man's words. But the lawyer didn't flinch. He rose again, his tone polite but dismissive. "With all respect," the lawyer said smoothly, "we appreciate Mr. Carter's sentiment, but sentiment doesn't fix safety risks. The engineering report clearly states that the hill is unstable. Public safety must come first." Joe watched him speak, watched the way the lawyer's hands moved confident, certain. He said nothing. He only folded his hat back against his chest, like a shield he had no intention of lowering. The council members shifted in their seats, exchanging glances. Joe could see the worry in some of their eyes. He could see how easily a promise of progress could outweigh the quiet pull of memory. But he didn't argue. He didn't plead. He simply stood there, as steady as the stones on that hill. When the questions began, they fell mostly on the side of the developer. Council members asked about tax revenue, about new sidewalks and bigger parking lots. The lawyer answered smoothly, his words weaving pictures of a town reborn, glossy and bright and new. But for every word he spoke, Joe Carter's silence was louder. He didn't interrupt. He didn't shout. He let the weight of what he represented fill the room, like a slow tide that couldn't be turned back. At the back of the room, a boy no older than 15 sat with his grandfather, a veteran who had once fought beside men whose names were now carved in stone. The boy watched Joe with wide eyes, the kind of eyes that still believed in something bigger than money. And in that boy's gaze, Joe found a quiet echo of the promise he had made so many years ago. The meeting stretched on. Arguments about zoning permits and insurance liabilities filled the air, each word chipping away at the hill Joe had tended for decades. But still he stood, hands steady on the brim of his hat, his eyes unblinking. When the council called for a brief recess, Joe stepped outside. The wind was cold off the water, and he turned his face into it, breathing deep. He didn't need warmth. He needed only the certainty that he had done what he could. He walked back up the hill as the sun dipped low behind the town. The sky was streaked with gold and soft gray, and the flags above the memorial flapped softly in the wind. Joe knelt beside the largest stone, his fingers tracing the etched names one by one. He didn't speak aloud. He didn't need to. The silence was enough, the silence of men who had given everything they had, and of one old man who refused to let that be forgotten. When he finally stood, he looked down at the town below. He saw the new buildings rising, the shimmer of fresh paint and polished glass. He saw the march of progress, and he didn't hate it. He just knew that there were some things progress didn't have the right to erase. That night, he sat in his small kitchen, the letter from the council laid flat on the table. He read it again, slowly, the words harsh and final. Final meeting, final decision. He set it aside, folding it once, then again, until it was small enough to slip into his pocket. He poured himself a cup of coffee and carried it to the window. Outside, the street lamps glowed soft and yellow, and in the distance, the hill rose dark against the sky. He watched it, the way a man might watch the tide come in, knowing it could not be stopped, but refusing to turn away. Joe Carter had never asked for thanks. He had never asked for recognition. He had given his years to that hill because it was the right thing to do. And tomorrow, he would stand again. Because even when the world seemed ready to forget, he would remember. That was his quiet vow. That was what kept him going. He leaned back in his chair, closing his eyes for a moment, letting the sound of the wind against the window fill the room. And in that quiet, he found a strength that no lawyer's report could ever measure. A strength born of memory and of the simple, stubborn faith that some things were meant to last. The next morning, the air around the town hall was colder than usual, a sharp wind cutting across the square. People arrived in small clusters, some speaking in low voices, others silent, their faces drawn and tense. The final meeting had been called one last chance to decide the fate of the hill. Inside the council chamber, the atmosphere was heavy. The wooden benches were filled with familiar faces, all of them waiting, shoulders hunched under the weight of uncertainty. The developers' team sat closest to the front, their suits as crisp and immaculate as their confidence. Joe Carter sat in the same spot as before, his old army hat resting in his lap. He kept his eyes forward, calm and steady, though he could feel the eyes of the room flicking toward him every so often. He didn't flinch. He had nothing left to prove, only the memory of those who had trusted him to stand watch. The council members shuffled their papers, their voices low but urgent. One by one, they spoke of safety concerns, of the town's need to grow. The lawyer for the developer rose again, his voice smooth as glass, weaving promises of prosperity and transformation. He spoke of blueprints and dollar signs, of new streets lined with neon signs and bustling crowds. He spoke of a brighter future, one that had no place for cracked stone and weathered flags. Joe listened, his face expressionless, hands folded tight around the hat in his lap. As the lawyer drew in a breath to deliver the final argument, the heavy doors of the chamber swung open. The sound was sudden, sharp, echoing across the hush that fell over the room. Every head turned, every conversation stilled, as a figure stepped through the doorway. "Never leave a brother behind," the voice said. Calm, unshaken, each word like the steady beat of a drum. The man who stood in the doorway was not a lawyer. He was not a politician. He wore a simple Navy uniform, the brass of his rank catching the light but never needing to shout. His presence filled the space the way only those who have stood in places no one else dares can do. It was Admiral William H. McRaven. He stepped forward, his gaze sweeping the room over the young mother clutching her son's hand, over the veterans with their quiet nods, over the lawyer who suddenly seemed small in his expensive suit. When he spoke, his voice was calm, but each word was wrapped in the steel of years spent shouldering burdens few could imagine. "Ladies and gentlemen," he began, his voice cutting through the tension like a blade. "I am William McRaven, retired Admiral of the United States Navy." His words rolled out, measured and resolute. "I am not here to threaten. I am here to remind." The room was silent. Even the lawyer's practiced calm seemed to flicker in the presence of something so utterly real. Joe sat still, his breath caught in his chest, watching the Admiral with eyes that shone faintly beneath the brim of his hat. McRaven's voice grew stronger as he spoke, each word a hammer driving into the bedrock of the room. "In this place, beneath the weathered stone that some of you call useless, rest the men who went before us. They have no voice left to speak. They cannot stand and demand the respect they have earned." He paused, his gaze sweeping the room again. "But I can." The lawyer shifted in his seat, his lips pressed in a tight line. The mayor leaned forward, eyes locked on the man who had once commanded thousands, who had faced down darkness and come through unbroken. "I have seen men fall," McRaven said, his voice softening for a moment. "I have watched them give everything they had, not for applause, not for glory, but because it was the right thing to do." His hand lifted, gesturing toward the hill beyond the windows, and all they ever asked of us was to remember. The silence in the room deepened, the air itself holding its breath. A young girl in the back, her hands wrapped tight around a small, folded flag, pressed it closer to her chest. Tears welled in her eyes, slipping down her cheeks as McRaven's words wrapped around her like a promise. "To tear this down," McRaven continued, his voice low but unyielding, "is to tear down the faith that courage never dies. It is to break a vow written in blood, never leave a brother behind." The lawyer lowered his eyes, fingers fidgeting with the edge of his papers. Even the council members, some of whom had leaned so close to the promises of progress, sat back in their chairs, the weight of those words settling like a stone in their chests. McRaven took a step closer, his boots quiet on the polished floor. "You can build your shining shopping centers anywhere," he said, his tone firm, "but here this ground holds things you cannot buy honor. Memory." A hush fell over the room as he paused, his eyes steady, unblinking. "And I swear to every man I've served with and to every man I've lost that I will not let you trample on that." The final words echoed in the air, a quiet thunder that settled deep into the bones of everyone present. No one spoke, no one moved. The lawyer sat back, his lips parted, but no words finding their way past the sudden knot in his throat. Joe Carter rose slowly from his seat. His hands trembled slightly, but his eyes were clear, lit with a pride he had kept buried in the quiet of each dawn on that hill. He moved forward, each step sure and measured, until he stood beside the Admiral. He said nothing. He didn't need to. Instead, he reached out and rested his hand on McRaven's shoulder, a simple gesture, but one that carried the weight of every name etched in stone. The room seemed to exhale. The young girl in the back wiped her tears, her mother's arm around her shoulders. The mayor closed her folder slowly. Her expression changed, no longer the cautious neutrality of a politician, but the quiet respect of someone who had just remembered what truly mattered. McRaven inclined his head to Joe, his lips pressed in a faint smile. In that brief, silent exchange, two men who had seen more than most found something unspoken between them, an understanding that didn't need explanation. And in that moment, the future of the Hill was no longer in the hands of men in suits or in the promises of profit. It belonged to the memory of the fallen and to the quiet, steady courage of those who refused to let them be forgotten. The weight of Admiral McRaven's words hung in the air long after they were spoken. Slowly, the council members straightened in their seats, their faces somber, their eyes no longer lost in spreadsheets and balance sheets. One by one, they exchanged glances, silent questions, silent answers until the mayor spoke softly. "We will put it to a vote," she said, her voice steady but gentle. "A final decision, as it should be." The room seemed to hold its breath as she called each name, each voice answering with a single word that would decide the fate of the Hill. When it was done, the decision was clear. The Hill would remain. The memorial would stand. In that moment, relief washed through the room like a quiet tide, gentle and undeniable. Outside, the air was cold and bright, the sun breaking through clouds that had seemed so heavy that morning. People spilled from the town hall, their footsteps echoing on the steps. Some paused to speak in hushed tones, their voices full of wonder and something close to reverence. The local newspaper picked up the story first. Their front page carried a picture of Joe Carter, his hand resting on the shoulder of the Admiral. The headline was simple, "A pledge kept." The story spread quickly, weaving its way through the streets of Harbor View and beyond. Soon, national outlets took notice. News vans rolled into town, reporters speaking in urgent tones about the Admiral's speech and the small-town fight for memory. They spoke of the Hill as sacred ground, of a community that had chosen dignity over dollars. Veterans from across the state began to arrive, their cars and trucks crowding the narrow roads that wound up to the Hill. They came in worn jackets and dress blues, some with canes, some with medals pinned to their chests. They stood at the memorial in small clusters, heads bowed, hands clasped in quiet prayer. One by one, they laid wreaths of fresh flowers, their colors bright against the weathered stone. They traced the names carved there, speaking them aloud in voices rough with emotion, each name a promise remembered, each touch a vow renewed. Through it all, Joe Carter kept to his routine. Each morning, he rose before the sun, pulling on the same faded coat, the small flag folded in his pocket. He climbed the hill with careful steps, feeling the weight of each footfall, feeling the wind that never stopped singing across the stones. He never spoke to the cameras that waited at the base of the hill. He never gave interviews or posed for pictures. When reporters called out to him, he would only nod politely and turn back to his work. Because for Joe, the story had never been about him. He would wipe the stone clean, his hand moving slow and sure. He would place fresh flowers in the vases, tucking the stems tight so they wouldn't fall in the wind. And always, he would pause at the largest stone, the one that held the names of the first friends he'd lost so long ago. "Sorry I'm a little late today," he would whisper, his voice barely more than a breath. "But I'm here now." It was a ritual he never missed. No matter how cold the wind, no matter how many strangers watched, the town began to see the Hill differently. Where once it was just a quiet place at the edge of things, it became something more. Parents brought their children, tracing the letters with small, curious fingers. School groups came with notebooks and cameras, their teachers telling stories of what had been saved. And in that new attention, the old hill found its voice again. The memorial became more than stone. It became a place where people remembered what mattered. A place where silence spoke louder than any speech. A place where those who lived in quiet dignity could stand and be seen. Joe never asked for thanks. He never asked for the world to notice. But in the days and weeks that followed, as the story spread and the visitors came, something shifted in the air. The hill was no longer a forgotten corner of a growing town. It was a promise that even in a world that rushed ahead, some things were meant to stay. Admiral McRaven's visit became a touchstone. People spoke of it in cafes and barber shops, of the way his voice had stilled the room, of the power in the simple promise he'd made never leave a brother behind. It became a lesson told and retold, a spark that caught in the quiet corners of Harbor View and spread like a gentle fire. One evening, long after the last news van had packed up and the sun had dipped low behind the hill, Joe Carter sat on the bench beside the largest stone. The wind was soft that night, the sky painted in shades of gold and deepening blue. He leaned back, his eyes tracing the stars as they emerged one by one. Around him, the hill was quiet, the town below lit with the warm glow of street lamps and porch lights. He could hear the distant crash of the surf, the sigh of the wind through the grass. In that quiet, he felt the weight of all he'd carried years of tending, of remembering. And he felt, too, the gentle lift of something new. The knowledge that he was no longer alone in his vigil. He rose slowly, his knees stiff, his breath steady. He pressed his hand once more to the cold stone, letting it anchor him as it always had. Then he turned, his steps sure as he walked down the hill toward the town that had finally remembered what he'd known all along. For Joe Carter, for Admiral McRaven, and for every name etched in that stone, there was no need for applause. There was no need for grand speeches or bright headlines, only the quiet truth that some promises made in silence, kept in silence, never fade. And in that truth, the hill would stand, held fast by the memory of those who had given everything, a place where the living could remember, and the fallen could rest, and a town could be proud to stand with them. In our darkest moments, kindness still finds a way, often in the quietest places. Not everyone who helps wants recognition. Some just need to know that today, someone isn't going hungry. And sometimes, that alone is enough to change a life. You may forget the story, but if no one retells it, history stays silent forever. Subscribe to Grateful Stories, where justice is honored, kindness is remembered, and no act of quiet heroism is ever lost.